All right, we'll just talk briefly about the autonomic nervous system. I just want you to be aware of how it's laid out and the different branches of it so that when you get to physiology, it makes sense. So, autonomic means kind of unconscious, not really voluntary nervous system, such as what triggers your muscles to contract in your arms and legs, but the part that we do unconsciously. Maybe it manages heart rate or blood pressure or glandular secretions. So this is the autonomic nervous system. And generally, we're talking about controlling smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is organ muscle. For example, the muscles of your stomach and your intestines, which regulate digestion, cardiac muscle, your heart muscle, and then glands. There's three divisions, two primary and one that we have learned a bit more about here in the last several years. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic are the two that you've probably heard of in the past. Sympathetic is your fight or flight response. It's often active if you are fearful, if you are anxious, if you are stressed, and also during exercise. So it's actually necessary during exercise in order to increase heart rate, to pump enough blood to the rest of our body. We need our sympathetic system. Parasympathetic system is the rest and digest. So this is active after you have a big meal, for example. It often antagonizes or has the opposite effect of the sympathetic nervous system. And so we'll talk about each of these separately, what they do, and how the nervous system, what the pattern looks like. And then there's an enteric nervous system, and we're not going to really talk about that anymore in this. We'll touch on it briefly in physiology, but the enteric nervous system is kind of the nervous system that's intrinsic to the gastrointestinal tract. It has its own communication system through nerves there, and that's also autonomic. But we're not going to really discuss that too much. I just want you to be aware that it exists. So, as I mentioned, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems often oppose each other, or we would say they antagonize each other, or they give antagonistic control. So, for example, if we're looking at heart rate, the sympathetic nervous system will increase the heart rate, whereas the parasympathetic system will decrease the heart rate. And we need both of them depending on what's going on at the time. Sometimes we will have only one division that controls an organ or a response, and sometimes we'll find an organ or a gland that responds to both stimuli, both sympathetic and parasympathetic stimuli. So sometimes just one, sometimes both with antagonistic control. Okay, the sympathetic system. I want you to know for each of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system, I want you to know which neurotransmitters are released, and we're going to break it up into two sections. So there's the preganglionic nerves. So those are the nerves that come out of the spinal cord, and they're going to communicate with the neuron cell bodies in the sympathetic ganglia that's just outside of the spinal cord. So those are the preganglionic nerves, the ones that are coming to the ganglion from the spinal cord. And then there's going to be the nerves that leave the ganglion and go out to the organ or the gland and have the actual effect on the target tissue. That's going to be the postganglionic neuron. So you'll hear me talk about what neurotransmitter is released from the preganglionic neuron and which neurotransmitter is released from the postganglionic neuron, and you'll need to know both. So if we look at the sympathetic system, we'll see that preganglionic nerves, they typically release acetylcholine onto the ganglionic neurons. And these are going to be excitatory. That means when the acetylcholine reaches the ganglionic neurons, it will cause those ganglionic neurons to fire an electrical signal that will activate the target tissue on the other end. So acetylcholine is what's released on the preganglionic, released from the preganglionic nerves onto the ganglionic nerves neurons. Once that ganglionic neuron is activated, it will then send an electrical signal that will be released at the target tissue, whether that's heart or stomach or gland. and it will release largely norepinephrine, is going to be the primary sympathetic postganglionic neurotransmitter, and that is almost always excitatory as well, which means it will cause increased activity wherever it's released. I have this picture over here. I could make you learn all of these different names of these autonomic nerves, but I decided you have enough information to learn already. So I'm just putting this picture in here to let you know that it's quite organized. So for example, eyes, glands of the neck, for example, heart and lungs, these all originate from the upper thoracic region of the spinal cord. And you can see that basically the gut, things in your abdomen, they're going to originate kind of from the middle. And then bladder, penis, uterus, kidneys, those will originate from lower on down in the spinal cord. You don't have to learn the names or where they originate. I just kind of want you to be aware anatomically that they're coming out of the spinal cord just like the other peripheral nerves do, but instead of going to, muscles and skin and things like that, they're going to your organs to help control the function of the organs. You do need to know, however, the different neurotransmitters that are released. Again, this is just to kind of give you a complete picture of where everything is going. You can see where these nerves are headed from the sympathetic chains out to their respective locations. And we already kind of talked about the abdominal pelvic division anyway. The ones that are going here to the uterus, the ovary, the penis, the bladder, the kidney, they're going to originate down here in the upper lumbar region. Again, you don't have to memorize that. I just want you to be aware that there is organization, that it is split up on according to which part of the spinal cord those signals originate. So damage to those areas of the spinal cord would also cause damage to the autonomic nervous system in those areas. There is something unique about the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and that's that it can affect the adrenal gland as well. So the adrenal gland is a small gland, usually covered in fat, that sits on the top of each of your kidneys, and part of the tissue of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla, which is the part in the middle, responds to sympathetic stimulation. And so when it is stimulated by the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, it will also release what we call catecholamines. These are the sympathetic neurotransmitters that are excitatory. You already learned about one of them, norepinephrine. The other one is epinephrine. And so whereas the postganglionic sympathetic nerves typically release norepinephrine, the adrenal gland is going to 75% release epinephrine in response to sympathetic stimulation. It does do another 25% of norepinephrine, but largely it's going to secrete epinephrine. So from the postganglionic neurons, you get norepinephrine in the sympathetic system, and from the adrenal medulla, you get epinephrine released into the system. They're both going to have similar effects. So what are the effects of the sympathetic system? Some of them you'll be aware of. We already talked about, for example, increased heart rate, also increased blood pressure. You get increased alertness as epinephrine and norepinephrine fall on the reticular activation center in the midbrain. That's going to activate that part of the nervous system and cause you to be more alert. Remember, we're talking about fight or flight, so I want you to imagine you're in the woods and you're being chased by a bear. That's going to activate the sympathetic system. So what would you expect? What would you need to survive? Well, you'll need to be alert. And so that's one of the effects of the sympathetic system. You'll also need some increased energy because you're going to be running as fast as you can. Disregard for danger and temporary insensitivity to pain. So if that bear happened to get a hold of you with his claws, You won't be incapacitated. You may find that you're able to still run and get away from that bear even though you've been injured. You'll hear stories of this, of people who were in car accidents or some sort of injury, and they didn't even know that they were injured until they removed themselves from the accident and the adrenaline kind of came down, and then they realized that they were bleeding, that they were having pain. And that's because adrenaline, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are the adrenaline molecules, they can do that. They can cause an insensitivity to pain, a disregard to danger. This is one of the reasons why, for example, drugs that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, like cocaine, can sometimes make people do stupid things because they don't realize that they're in danger. Sometimes they jump off things that are higher than you should jump off of, and they injure themselves. They may feel invincible, like they can't be hurt, and so they do, things that are not smart, thinking that they can't be hurt. And that's because the sympathetic system is in overdrive when you take a drug like cocaine. You get increased heart rate, we talked about, increased contraction strength of the heart. You get increased breathing rate and breathing depth so that you can get oxygen to deliver oxygen to the tissues that are making energy as you're running away from the bear. Increased muscle tone and shivering. I can tell you almost everybody who's been in a serious accident, by the time they get to the emergency room, within 15 or 20 minutes, they start shaking all over. And that's just that adrenaline, that sympathetic neurotransmitter and hormone release. One of the side effects is shivering of the muscles. So they look like they're cold, they look like they're shivering, but it's not really that they're cold at all. In fact, we'll put layers of blankets on them and they keep shaking. It's just because that's one of the side effects of adrenaline, of epinephrine and norepinephrine. You also get increased breakdown of energy reserves like glycogen and fat, which is important because you're going to need that energy in order to help your muscles contract more because, again, you're running away from the bear. Okay, let's look at the parasympathetic system. You're not going to have to memorize these ganglionic neurons and the different ganglion like ciliary and pterygopalatine and otic ganglion. I just put them here so that you're aware that there is this organization. Notice that most of the, whereas the sympathetic system basically was coming from the upper thoracic and the lower lumbar, the parasympathetic is going to come from kind of higher up in the brainstem and also lower down in the lower parts of the lumbosacral, really the sacral portion excuse me, of the spinal cord. What I do want you to take away from this slide, though, is that the vagus nerve carries 75% of the parasympathetic information. So that's an awful lot of your parasympathetic stimulation coming from one nerve. So you need to know the name of that nerve, which we already learned in cranial nerves, but you have to understand its importance to the parasympathetic nervous system, since it's most of it. Just in picture form, you can see the same thing here. Here is the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, and notice that it is sending signals to the heart, to the lungs, to the liver, to the stomach, to the pancreas, to the intestines, to the colon. It is taking care of most of the parasympathetic signals. Just again, for completeness sake, just so that you can see how the information is going from the brainstem or spinal cord out to the tissues, you do have to know that both the preganglionic and the postganglionic are going to release acetylcholine. And that's going to be the neurotransmitter that is functioning in the parasympathetic nervous system. So remember, in the sympathetic, you had acetylcholine in the preganglionic and norepinephrine in the postganglionic. Here in the parasympathetic, you have acetylcholine for both. So that should be pretty easy to remember. What are the effects of parasympathetic innervation? Excuse me. In a lot of ways, they're just the opposite of the sympathetic, right? So you're going to get, for example, constriction of the respiratory passageway. Remember, sympathetic kind of made you breathe deeper and faster. Parasympathetic is going to actually constrict your airways, making it a little bit more difficult to breathe deeply. You're going to get a reduced heart rate and a reduced force of contraction. So in some ways, it antagonizes sympathetic stimulation, but you also get some unique function from the parasympathetic nervous system. You get constriction of pupils. On the sympathetic side, you get dilation of pupils because, again, when you're running away from the bear, you're going to be pretty wide-eyed. You want as much light coming in so that you can make your way through the forest and away from the bear. Parasympathetic is going to give you constriction of the pupils, but you get a lot of digestive functions from the parasympathetic system as well. This is why we say rest and digest for the parasympathetic. You're going to get secretions from digestive glands. You're going to get contraction of the muscle of the GI tract. You're going to get the urge to defecate or to have a bowel movement. You're also going to get urinary bladder contraction, which will start the process of urination. So think rest and digest. It's heavy on the digestion side, and then it also antagonizes some of the sympathetic stimulation. A point here on sexual arousal. Both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system are involved in, especially in the male, sexual arousal and ejaculation. So we use this term. It's a little bit crude, but it really helps you remember point and shoot. If you're thinking about a male, like a penis, in order to have an erection, that's the point. The P stands for parasympathetic. And in order to ejaculate semen, that's the S found in shoot for sympathetic. So the parasympathetic system causes sexual arousal and erection, and the sympathetic system causes ejaculation of semen. So point and shoot helps you remember the P and S of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. I just mentioned briefly the antagonistic control. I've already mentioned that earlier in this lecture. I just wanted to have a slide to point it out. It's going to be really important when you guys get to physiology. You're going to see this antagonistic control, especially in the cardiovascular system, where the sympathetic tends to speed things up and increase heart activity, and the parasympathetic seems to do the opposite: decrease heart rate, decrease contractility, decrease blood pressure. And so the heart responds to both. It can respond to sympathetic and parasympathetic signals, and that's how we regulate our heart rate and our blood pressure.